They were farmers in a harsh land, hunters in the deep forests, worshippers of gods both feared and revered. Yet from these scattered Norse tribes, a people would emerge who mastered the sea, carried fire and steel to distant shores, and forever etched their name into history. This is the story of how the Vikings began. Before they became raiders, before their longships darkened the horizons of Europe, the Vikings were something else entirely. They were survivors in one of the most unforgiving environments of the ancient world. The cold, windswept lands of Scandinavia forged a people, hardened by the struggle for life. This struggle would not only shape their character, but also their destiny. In this journey, we will uncover the transformation of the Norse. From scattered tribal farmers to fearless seafarers, we will explore their earliest roots, their myths and beliefs, their ways of life, and the innovations that prepared them for the dawn of the Viking Age. So sit back, and let us step into the mists of the north, to witness the birth of the Viking people. Long before the first Viking raids on foreign shores, Scandinavia was a land at the edge of the known world. Rugged mountains, endless forests, and frigid seas defined the homeland of the Norse. Winters were long and brutal. Summers were short but alive with growth. In these lands, survival required strength, resilience, and above all, community. The earliest ancestors of the Vikings were not conquerors, but farmers and herders. They cleared forests to grow barley and rye. They tended sheep, goats, and cattle. And they built small wooden houses that clung close together for warmth. The soil was thin, rocky, and often poor. Yet through determination, the Norse learned to coax life from it. They were bound to the rhythms of the land, the passing of the seasons, and the endless cycle of birth and death. But to understand how these simple farmers became legendary seafarers, one must look deeper into the culture, the beliefs, and the values that gave rise to their transformation. The Norse did not see themselves as mere men and women. They believed themselves children of the gods, woven into a cosmos where giants, spirits, and divine forces shaped every storm and every harvest. Their myths told of Odin, the wise wanderer and seeker of knowledge, Thor, the thunderer who defended mankind from chaos, and Freya, god of fertility and prosperity. Every ritual, every offering, every sacred grove tied them to these powers. These myths were more than stories. They were a worldview. The harshness of the land demanded courage, and their gods demanded bravery, honor, and strength. A man or woman's worth was measured not only in wealth, but in reputation and deeds. This concept, honor or drengskaper, would guide the Norse as they stepped from their villages to the seas beyond. But what truly set the Norse apart from their neighbors was geography. Scandinavia was hemmed in by seas and fjords, riddled with rivers and islands. Water was everywhere, and from an early time, the Norse learned to travel by it. Small boats gave way to larger vessels. Fishing turned into trading, and trading, in time, would turn into raiding. Yet before the rise of the longship, there were centuries of change. Archaeology tells us that the early Norse people were part of the wider Germanic world. Their language, Old Norse, descended from Proto-Germanic, and their traditions carried echoes of ancient Indo-European beliefs. The Bronze Age rock carvings of Scandinavia reveal images of ships, warriors, and ritual scenes, hints of a seafaring and martial culture that predated the Viking Age by over 1,000 years. By the Iron Age, Scandinavian tribes had begun to forge distinct identities. Their villages grew larger, their chieftains more powerful. Trade routes connected them to the wider world. Amber from the Baltic, furs from the northern forests, and iron from their forges found their way into the hands of Romans, Celts, and Greeks. In exchange, the Norse received coins, glass, jewelry, and ideas. Contact with Rome, in particular, left its mark. Roman coins have been unearthed in Scandinavia, buried as hoards or worn as ornaments. To the Norse, Rome was a distant, mighty power, but one that could be reached, even if only through middlemen and traders. These connections planted seeds. They taught the Norse that beyond their cold seas lay lands rich with goods, cities filled with wealth, and cultures different from their own. But while they traded, they also remained fiercely independent. No empire ruled over Scandinavia. No legions marched through their fjords. Their freedom, though hard-earned, became a cherished way of life. And in this crucible of isolation, hardship, and occasional contact, the identity of the Norse took shape. The Norse world was held together not by kings or empires, but by kinship. Family, clan, and community formed the backbone of society. Each man and woman belonged to a family, a lineage that tied them to ancestors and to the living. Loyalty to family was paramount. Disputes between families could simmer for years, leading to feuds that only blood or careful settlement could end. At the heart of every community stood the chieftain, or jarl. Unlike the distant rulers of great civilizations, the Norse chieftain lived among his people. His wealth came from land, cattle, and followers, but his power depended on honor, generosity, and strength. A good leader rewarded loyalty with feasts, gifts, and protection. In return, his followers gave him service in war and support in peace. This bond of lord and retainer, called comitatus among the Romans, found its northern echo in the Norse halls. Warriors pledged their loyalty, not to a crown or state, but to the man they trusted to lead them to victory. Out of this grew a warrior culture that valued bravery above life itself. To die well, with weapon in hand and courage in heart, was to secure eternal fame. The sagas and skaldic poems of later centuries remind us that to the Norse, memory was immortality. The deeds of the brave lived on in song long after the flesh had turned to dust. In such a worldview, fear of death could not hold sway. Instead, men sought opportunity, adventure, and glory wherever it could be found. But Norse society was not only warriors and chiefs. The majority were farmers, tending their livestock, harvesting their grain, and fishing the seas. Women, too, held important roles. They managed the household, preserved traditions, and often wielded influence in matters of inheritance and kinship. Some women, remembered as Sikana, held spiritual power, practicing the mystical art of seer, weaving fate, and communing with unseen forces. Children grew up in this world of myth and struggle, learning from parents, elders, and the land itself. Boys were trained in hunting and combat, girls in weaving, farming, and healing. Yet roles were not as rigid as in many other societies. A woman might inherit land, a man might become skilled in craft. In all things, survival required adaptability. Over generations, these values, kinship, honor, bravery, and resilience, prepared the Norse for expansion. But there was another force at work: the sea itself. The geography of Scandinavia is unlike most lands. Deep fjords carved by ancient glaciers cut into the coasts. Islands dotted the waters. Rivers stretched inland like arteries. Travel over land was slow, hindered by dense forests and rugged terrain. But the sea was everywhere, a highway as much as a barrier. To the Norse, learning to navigate the waters was not a luxury, but a necessity. Fishing sustained life. Boats carried people to trade with neighbors, to explore nearby islands, and to raid when times grew hard. The earliest Norse boats were simple dugouts, hollowed from logs. But soon, they developed plank-built vessels, lashed together with iron rivets and animal sinew. These ships were strong, flexible, and light enough to be carried overland when rivers ended. By the time of the early Iron Age, Scandinavian shipbuilders had begun experimenting with designs that would, in centuries to come, culminate in the legendary lockship. Wide, shallow hulls allowed boats to travel both on open seas and up shallow rivers. Oars gave power when winds failed, and the curved prows, sometimes carved with dragons or serpents, gave the vessels both protection and identity. Such innovations did not appear overnight. They were the product of centuries of seafaring tradition, of trial and error in a land where the sea could never be ignored. And as their ships improved, so too did their reach. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, Norse traders were already venturing southward. The amber of the Baltic found eager buyers in the Roman world. In return, Roman coins and goods filtered north. To the Norse, these treasures were not only valuable, but symbols of distant wealth, proof that beyond their own fjords lay lands of unimaginable bounty. The collapse of the Roman Empire in the West did not sever these connections. If anything, it opened new opportunities. With old powers weakened, new trade routes and raids beckoned. Across the North Sea lay the fertile lands of Britain. To the south, the coasts of Francia offered riches. To the east, along the rivers of modern-day Russia, lay vast networks of trade that could reach all the way to Byzantium. The Norse had not yet become Vikings in the true sense, but the stage was set. They had the skills, the ships, and the restless spirit. All they needed was the spark, and that spark would come. The transformation of the Norse into seafaring raiders did not happen in isolation. Step by step, contact with the outside world pushed them forward. Each encounter planted new ideas, offered new temptations, and revealed new weaknesses to exploit. To the west lay the British Isles, a patchwork of Celtic kingdoms, Roman ruins, and new Anglo-Saxon settlers carving out their realms. These lands were fertile, dotted with monasteries and churches, their walls lined with gold, silver, and manuscripts bound in leather and adorned with jewels. To men who had grown up in timber halls, these treasures seemed almost otherworldly. To the south, the Frankish kingdoms of continental Europe had risen from the collapse of Rome. Their kings claimed divine sanction, their cathedrals stretched toward the heavens, and their rivers were crowded with merchants carrying wine, cloth, and coin. The Franks, however, were divided by rivalries, their power great but often stretched thin, and to the east, vast opportunities awaited. The Baltic Sea opened onto a world of Slavic tribes, Baltic peoples, and Finno-Ugric cultures. Beyond them, the mighty rivers, the Dvina, the Dnieper, the Volga, led like highways into the heart of the East. There, Norse merchants discovered bustling markets, trading not only in furs and amber, but in silver, silk, and spices brought north from the riches of Byzantium and the Caliphates. These encounters enriched the Norse materially and culturally. The more they traded, the more they realized the disparity between their own lives and the wealth of others. A Frankish chalice, gleaming in the torchlight of a chieftain's hall, was more than decoration. It was a symbol of power, a promise of prestige. And where such wealth could be gained by trade, it might also be seized by force. It is here, in this tension between trade and raiding, that the Viking spirit was born. The Norse were not unique in raiding their neighbors. Warfare and plunder were ancient practices across Europe. But what made the Norse distinct was their ability to reach targets far beyond their borders. Most tribes raided their immediate neighbors. The Norse, with their ships and seamanship, could strike across seas and rivers, appearing suddenly and vanishing just as quickly. In the centuries before the famed raid on Lindisfarne in 793, evidence suggests that Scandinavian raiders had already begun testing their strength. Small expeditions along the Baltic coast, hit-and-run strikes against rivals, and raids across the North Sea may have occurred long before the first chroniclers recorded them. To those who endured them, these early attacks must have seemed like storms from the north, swift, violent, and devastating. But what turned these raids from small skirmishes into a defining feature of the Viking Age? Part of the answer lies in population. By the 7th and 8th centuries, Scandinavian communities had grown. Farmland was limited. Sons who inherited little land needed other outlets. Some sought fortune as merchants, others as mercenaries, and still others as raiders. A restless energy built within Norse society, fueled by ambition and necessity. Another part lies in shipbuilding. By this time, Norse craftsmen had perfected the clinker-built hull, where overlapping planks created vessels that were light, strong, and flexible. Combined with the addition of a single large sail, these ships could harness the wind, traveling faster and farther than ever before. A longship could glide silently up a river or cut swiftly across the open sea, its shallow draft allowing it to beach directly on shore or escape over sandbars where larger vessels could not follow. And finally, ideology played its role. The Norse belief system did not discourage raiding, it glorified it. To die in battle was to earn a place in Valhalla, to feast with Odin until the end of days. Wealth was to be taken, honor was to be won, and fame was to be remembered. In such a culture, to embark on a raid was not only practical but honorable, a test of courage that could secure eternal renown. Thus, as the 8th century dawned, the Norse were ready. Farmers, traders, and warriors alike had been forged by hardship, bound by honor, and empowered by ships unlike any the world had yet seen. All that remained was for the first great strikes to announce their arrival to history. And when they came, they would shock the world. The year was 793, on a quiet island off the coast of Northumbria. The monks of Lindisfarne went about their prayers. Theirs was a sacred place, a jewel of Christian devotion, far from the struggles of kingdoms and kings. The tide rolled against the shore, gulls wheeled overhead, and the chants of the faithful drifted toward heaven. And then, the silence broke. From the sea came the longships, swift, narrow, their dragon prows rising from the waves. Oars bit into the water, sails snapped with the wind. Before the monks could grasp what was happening, men poured onto the beach, tall, fierce, clad in leather, mail, and iron. In their hands, axes and swords gleamed. The storm had arrived. The attack on Lindisfarne shocked the Christian world. To the chroniclers of the time, it seemed like the wrath of God himself. In their writings, the raiders were described as heathens, wolves among lambs, demons unleashed upon the faithful. The monastery was sacked, its treasures stolen, its altars desecrated, its brothers slain or dragged into slavery. For the first time, Europe felt the full force of the Norse, and with that single raid, the Viking Age began. But for the Norse themselves, Lindisfarne was not the beginning. It was the culmination of centuries of change. The men who landed on that holy island were the descendants of farmers who had struggled for survival in the rocky soils of Scandinavia. They were the heirs of chieftains who had led their people through feast and famine. They were the product of a culture that prized honor, bravery, and the pursuit of fame above all else. And they were the masters of ships that represented the finest achievements of their age. To them, the raid was not sacrilege. It was opportunity. Wealth, slaves, and glory. All could be won on foreign shores. The monasteries and undefended towns of Britain and Francia were ripe for plunder. And if the gods smiled, the names of these warriors would echo in saga and song for generations. The rise of the Viking raider, then, was no accident. It was born of necessity, innovation, and belief. Scandinavia's limited farmland had driven its young men outward. The perfection of the longship had given them the means to travel swiftly and strike unexpectedly. And their faith in Odin, Thor, and the warrior's code of honor gave them the will to risk everything. When these forces combined, the transformation was complete. The Norse were no longer just farmers, traders, or herders. They had become seafarers, explorers, and raiders. Vikings. The world beyond Scandinavia would never be the same. Thus ends the tale of how the Norse rose from simple tribes to the dawn of the Viking Age. Their story was only beginning. From Lindisfarne to the far reaches of the East, from Iceland to the gates of Byzantium, the Vikings would carve their place in history with steel and sail. If you have walked with us through these origins, share your voice in the comments below. What fascinates you most about the rise of the Vikings? Strike the like rune to show your strength, and join our fellowship by subscribing, so that you may not miss the sagas yet to come. For the sea is wide, and the journey of the Vikings has only just begun.